people are having trouble, I think, nowadays keeping up with the annals of the misdeeds and strange deeds of the Donald J. Trump administration. It is an understandable cognitive deficit that we all face on a daily basis. And one of the stories you may have overlooked was the Trump administration's plan to bail out energy generators, to bail out coal and nuclear generators. But they do have such a plan, and it's come in for some heavy challenges. And here to update us on this underreported, but in my opinion, very important story, joining us once again is Gavin Bade. Gavin is a senior reporter with Utility Dive, which is a specialty publication covering this area. And with no further ado, Gavin, welcome.
Thanks, RJ. Glad to be back.
So glad to have you back. So Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, criticized. First of all, tell us about the bailout itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So about 2 weeks ago, it was like 2 Fridays ago, President Trump directed Rick Perry to give him recommendations.
And Rick Perry is the energy secretary.
I'm sorry, Rick Perry, the head of the Department of Energy, to give him recommendations to save coal and nuclear plants specifically that are threatened with retirement. Retirement before the end of what operators would say is their functional life. The problem with these plants is they're simply too expensive. They don't make money in the wholesale electricity markets that serve about 2/3 of the U.S. population, and because they're not as cheap as natural gas-fired power plants or renewable energy, solar and wind in many regions, they're threatened by retirement.
And these are, I was correct, these are, tell me if I wasn't correct, these are coal and nuclear.
Yes, yes. Right? Specifically, they've singled out coal and nuclear plants. They say that these assets are critical to national security. So to back up a little bit, the day before Trump issued that order to Rick Perry saying, give me some recommendations to save these plants, a DOE memo, a memo from the Department of Energy was leaked that kind of outlined a few different strategies that DOE could take to save these plants. One of them is its emergency authority under the Federal Power Act, which is DOE's kind of foundational statute. It's called Section 202 of the Federal Power Act, basically says that during an emergency on the power grid, maybe a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or something, the Department of Energy can order that certain plants stay open or that they run, just so that they can make sure that people have power, right?
Well, okay, but
that's one revenue. That's one avenue. So I can touch on the other one.
Sure, yeah, let's do that. But first, I want to make sure we understand that one. So if that were to happen, if they were to issue, I guess they would issue a directive of some kind instructing the plants to stay open, would that mean that consumers were then forced to pay the higher prices? Or
yes.
It says, okay, so
yeah, what would happen in that case is that, if they said if you had a nuclear plant or a coal plant, in the service territory of your utility that was going to stay open, you would pay for that on your power bill, just as like you pay for all of the other power that gets generated and flows into your home. The difference is that these plants are not generating power as much simply because they're more expensive to operate.
So people don't want their power because it's too
exactly.
expensive.
They don't clear the wholesale power auctions.
So before we even get to the other alternative, it sounds to me like it would be what's the right way to describe it? Almost a de facto tax on utility customers, because they would have to pay more for their energy because the Trump administration has made the decision to save these plants. Is that fair?
Almost certainly, yes.
Yeah.
It's a little bit difficult to tell how much this plan, or kind of the outlines of the plan that was in this leaked memo, would really cost. It references, it references saving a specific list of plants that was not included with the leaked memo. So it's difficult to know how much it would cost. But if you're going to keep more expensive power generation online, and you're going to have to pay for that somehow.
Right.
They don't want to operate at a loss. It doesn't work like that.
Right.
So,
right.
it would cost more.
So, okay, so that's one alternative. How many others were there?
So there was one other big thing that they said they could do, which is even a little bit stranger than that emergency authority. Usually they say that the emergency authority is for acts of God, not acts of markets, right? You know, a big natural disaster or something. The other avenue is even a little bit more strange. It's a Cold War era law called the Defense Production Act. And basically what it allows the Department of Energy to do is during times of extreme duress, usually wartime, they can basically nationalize part of the power sector and say that a generator must run, or you must buy a certain type of resource. Maybe it's coal, maybe it's gas or something. And it's basically a de facto nationalization of a certain part of the power sector. So the Department of Energy could say, well, this nuclear plant or this coal plant is critical to national security. So, you know, entities in the area, you have to buy power from it. And it's a little bit unclear who would actually foot the bill for that, because if it's going to be put on your power bill, then it has to go through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which earlier this year actually rejected out of hand an earlier subsidy proposal from the Department of Energy. So they probably don't want to do it that way. But if they don't go through the Energy Commission, then maybe they'll have to go through Congress and appropriate money, which would be a very messy process, you know, trying to get through Congress to keep more expensive power generators online. So there's a lot of uncertainties around this.
Okay, but let me make sure I understand that too. And for our listeners, again, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it is an agency, it's independent, it's got Democrats and Republicans both as commissioners, so Trump can't just order them to do it. If they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it, right?
He tried to.
Yeah, okay, I'm sure. But just because that small sound you heard might have been my mind being blown. There was actually a document saying that the Trump administration might consider nationalizing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the best tweet that I saw about this was actually from a conservative commentator who was saying that this is seizing the means of production to own the libs, or to own the liberals, right?
Right, really, to force coal and nuclear down their throat.
It's really been people have been kind of taken aback at this. You know, a former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission told me, he called this a Soviet-style directive, you know, just, it's kind of a command and control thing. These plants we think are important, so we're going to keep them open. And the thing that begs to be said about this is that there are a lot of other entities that are responsible for the national security and the reliability of the bulk power system. And none of them think that national security is at threat today because of threats to our power system. So this Department of Energy memo, it really singled out threats to the natural gas pipeline system. What's happening in the power system right now is we're burning a lot more natural gas because it's cheaper. And the Department of Energy is concerned, they say they're concerned, that if a terrorist or if some group was supposedly attacked a bunch of pipelines or compressor stations, that could take natural gas power plants offline. And they say that this risk means that we need these big generators, what they call fuel-secure generators, things that have a big pile of coal on site or a bunch of nuclear fuel on site. They say, well, they don't have pipelines, so they're not as vulnerable to these sort of attacks. So we need to keep them online just in case, you know, someone knocks out all the pipelines.
And just to be clear, first of all, a generator is a physical plant that produces. Yes, so just so people understand that. And then secondly, that concern actually sounds like it could be legitimate, right? That whether I don't know whether they mean it legitimately or not, but it sounds like there would be legitimate reason to think that if we get overly dependent on cheap natural gas, and natural gas is delivered through pipelines and other facilities where large amounts of it go through narrow distribution channels that might be disrupted by terrorism, that maybe there is a legitimate reason to keep our energy grid decentralized, the sources of energy decentralized, for sake of security. Maybe I'm playing devil's advocate, but it seems legitimate.
No, I understand. The issue is that very few people see the issue this way in the power sector. Okay. So, for instance, I was at a congressional hearing this week. I was at a Senate hearing with all 5 members of FERC, of the Federal Energy Commission. Right. And 4 of these members, there's 3 Democrats, there's 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 4 of them were appointed by Trump. Now, they all get classified intelligence briefings on the security, the cybersecurity, and physical security threats to all of our energy infrastructure, including natural gas pipelines. And Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico asked them point blank at this hearing, do you think there is a national security crisis facing the domestic power system? Crickets. No one said anything. They all stayed silent.
So
and it's just
so we take that as a no.
We take that as a no. And afterward, some people, some of the regulators came out and said more. Robert Powelson, one of the Republican commissioners from Pennsylvania, which is a big gas state but also a big coal state, made the point to me. He said, "Well, look, all power technology has an industrial control system, whether it's a natural gas plant or a pipeline or a coal plant. Now, do we know that one of these is more susceptible to hacking than the other?" The answer that he said was no, we don't know. And in any case, is it worth spending what is likely to be billions and billions of dollars to keep these big, older, more expensive generators online?
See, and I'm going to jump in just for a second. And again, we're talking with Gavin Bade of Utility Dive. It seems to me, if you're really concerned about national security and making sure that our energy production is protected from terrorism, there's a simple answer: solar. Because if every home in the country and every business in the country and every motor vehicle in the country is driving primarily, perhaps not exclusively because of the environmental weather conditions and so on, primarily off solar, there's no central distribution system, there's no central production point. It seems to me to be almost, if not entirely, impervious to terrorism. So why wouldn't they be pushing solar? I think I know the answer.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think that your point about, solar distributed energy is very well taken, right? That doing more of that can enhance the resilience of the power sector and its, and its strength, its ability to bounce back and withstand disruption. I think that the bigger thing here is that this security argument, what a lot of people in the power sector see it as, is a red herring to just save these plants that, let's face it, a lot of them belong to allies of the Trump administration. So we know that, Rick Perry and even President Trump has been meeting with coal magnates like Bob Murray, who runs the largest privately owned coal company in the nation. We know that they've been meeting with them. We know that a lot of these plans were actually submitted to the Department of Energy, submitted to the Trump administration. This is how you save coal plants. This is how you save nuclear plants. Over the past year, there's just reporting last week that Bob Murray himself drafted 6 executive orders that he wanted President Trump to sign. So they've been in regular communication with the owners of these more expensive coal and nuclear plants. And that's really, they've just been trying to find an excuse to save them. At first it was, oh, well, they're needed for power reliability. Okay. Then it was, oh, well, they're needed for resilience, the ability to bounce back from outages. That's when FERC stepped in and said, oh, actually, they made this proposal to the energy regulators. They unanimously rejected in January. So they said, oh, well, we can't do it on resilience grounds. Well, maybe it's a national security risk. Maybe we can save them this way. So, I mean, it's either the cynical or the real way to look at it, but a lot of people think that, this whole security argument, well, it's a good conversation to have about the power sector. The way that DOE is framing it is really just a red herring to bail out a lot of their friends in the coal sector.
Right. So one way to do that, if you want to bail out your friends, is to say, well, we looked at different ways to solve this problem, to put out one idea that everybody will reject, which is nationalizing Bob Murray, and then to put out another way that everybody won't reject, they hope, which is to make sure Bob Murray keeps making a lot of money off his inefficient plant. Is that a possible explanation?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see which one they go with. I actually think that the Defense Production Act is the more likely option.
Oh, really?
Because I think, when I talk to power sector lawyers about this, it's more difficult for a court to step in and issue an injunction when you have a federal agency or the White House itself saying that there is a national security concern. Identifying something as a threat to national security carries more weight in many courts than just saying, oh, there's a problem with power markets.
So let me ask you, how does Bob Murray make money? if they step in on national security grounds.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit more indirect for him because he owns the mining company, right? But you know, if you keep these plants open, then
he keeps selling his coal.
Exactly. And
so the real beneficiary here, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but the real beneficiary here, even if you take the quote unquote nationalization route, is, and I'm sure they could tweak that all sorts of ways so that there's money being made there too, but the real beneficiary is the seller of coal.
The seller of coal and the owners of coal and nuclear plants. Another person who's been in regular contact with the Trump administration is Chuck Jones, the CEO of First Energy, who is, you know, planning to close, I think it's 2 nuclear plants and a big coal plant right now in Ohio. They have seen their entire unregulated generation subsidiary, their power plant business, went completely bankrupt, and they're trying to sell off these assets. So they've been arguing to the Trump administration, help us to get a couple more years life out of these so we can sell them to a private equity firm and make a little money off of them before we close up shop on this business.
And then the executives can all cash out and retire. So now, I know you well enough to know, I think you probably have gotten here ahead of me. But it seems to me that we have an administration and a party who describe themselves as conservative. Mm-hmm. And yet the market, the free market has spoken and said, we don't want this energy. We don't like it. It costs too much. And they want to use the power of the federal government to overrule the free market. It seems to me that's not a very conservative thing to do.
I can't say whether it's conservative or not, but I can tell you that that's exactly what's happening. You know, it's been very interesting to see. Even, you know, before the House and the Senate, Rick Perry will go, and one of his favorite lines to go back to when someone raises this question is, "Oh, well, we've never had free markets in electricity anyway. You know, am I going to leave, you know, keeping the lights on for grandma? Am I going to leave that up to the free market? No, I want that to be, you know, I need some assurance that it's going to be there, you know." And there's maybe an embedded critique of market functions in there that Rick Perry doesn't necessarily know he's getting at. But he makes this, you know, he makes this argument all the time that, you know, well, if, you know, to keep the lights on, we just can't leave it up to some willy-nilly market. We have to make sure that these assets stay on.
Well,
now, I will say they only started to make this argument when, you know, the big coal and nuclear plants were starting to come offline. It wasn't when wind and solar weren't as competitive, right? They were saying, oh, you know, we can't subsidize them because we need to, retain the market functions. So, you know, I think at the end of the day, everyone likes ideology until their benefactors start to hurt, right? And then real politics comes into play.
So we have about, it's very, very interesting. We have about 60 seconds left. What's next? Any sense of next steps, next outcomes? I know there are a lot of folks out there, especially the Regulatory Commission voicing objections. Any sense of what happens in the next few months? Yeah,
right now we're just all waiting for Rick Perry to issue his recommendations to save these plants. I would expect, you know, as soon as those things are issued or as soon as there is an order from the Department of Energy, that'll just be a rush to the D.C. Circuit Courthouse to file the, to file all of the challenges to it. And then I guess you just have to pray that you get the right D.C. Circuit panel. Usually they hear cases with panels of 3 judges out of their selection. And whether you want it or not, you just got to hope that you get the right judges on that panel. I do think, however, that if they do something really significant and really unprecedented, that the D.C. Circuit could choose to hear, all the judges could choose to hear the case en banc, like they did with the Obama administration's carbon regulations. That would set up a really high stakes battle at the D.C. Circuit that, you know, all of us journalists would get geared up for. Yeah, no, it would be extremely interesting. Well, Gavin Bade of Utility Dive, thanks for coming in. I learned a lot from this, including that there's at least one area where I agree with Rick Perry. So how about that? So Gavin, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the program. RJ. Really appreciate it.